Precious Lord, Almighty God, give me grace and give me wisdom, that my lisping lips may speak your truth, that we all may find inspiration in your holy gospel. In Jesus' name. At the beginning of the gospel, we have the Word was made flesh. Verbum caro factum est. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And for most of us in the here and the now, the Word is a confusing concept. It is helpful to know that in the philosophy of the Greek world, the Word was the entire canon of beliefs and doings of a philosopher. So a great philosopher had a word. A great philosopher had a canon of opinion and a canon of belief, a canon of potential and a canon of exhortation which made their word. So when we read in John, which is a very theological gospel about the Word being made flesh, it was the entire aspiration and intent of God, of divinity, that was brought together in this spark, which was human flesh, which came to dwell among us. And that's vitally important because humanity is tortured by dualism. Humanity is tortured by this idea that there are pots of things. One pot which is good, one pot which is bad. One pot which is light, one pot which is dark. One pot which is spirit, one pot which is flesh. One pot which is holy, one pot which is unholy. And what it means is that God is eventually etched away at until God just dwells in those things which we all agree are comfortable and lovely and pretty and delightful. And the vast majority of creation and of humanity and of our lives are outside of that little God, that tiny God, that poverty-stricken God that can only dwell where it's warm and cozy and dry and light and reassuring, where there is no pain, where there is no darkness, where there are none of those things that challenge us and lead us on. And that little God, that tiny God, is the God that most people expect to transform their lives. But that little God only has a tiny place in which to live, a place which most of us only actually reach on occasional points, if ever, a place where most of us do not dwell. So can we wonder why we are distraught and confused that there appears to be no God, no thing of the divine in the place in which we dwell, when we will not allow the true and almighty God to expand to fill all things, just as that God made all things? There is no dualism. The flesh we despise is God's own precious flesh, just as Jesus was God's own precious Son and was made of flesh. The darkness that terrifies us is the holy darkness of God that symbolizes the mystery and unknowing with which we approach Almighty God. The pain that we desperately try to avoid is almost invariably that thing which, with the benefit of hindsight, shows us the most glorious transitions and changes in our life. The death we are terrified of is the ultimate crowning of our human lives, where all healing happens, where all things are made well again, when all will be well and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Amen. We live in a world of shadows and horrors that are not real shadows and horrors. They are masks that we put up that hide the face of Almighty God. And Christmas Day shows us that Almighty God does not hide, cannot hide. Almighty God is not tiny, is not poverty-stricken. The way some Christians behave about God, you'd think that God was a very frail old gentleman that needed helping to the lavatory. That needed protecting and wrapping up because, he's got rheumatism and feels the cold something horrible, and needs us to protect his dignity. Almighty God does not need us to protect Almighty God's dignity. We need Almighty God to protect what shreds of dignity we have left. The business of taking this unknowable, majestic, extraordinary God inaccessible light that lives in a cloud of unknowing, and squeezing that God into a prissy, tacky, tawdry little box that we keep on our mantelpieces, on our shelves at home, and say, oh, that's God, whenever anyone comes in. That's a very undignified process. This God that crowned the mountains with snow, this God that throws up the mighty mountains around us, that has sundered our valley with a great fault, where continents slide against each other, that God that made the ground 60 miles beneath our feet, where it joins with the molten magma of the earth, that God that made the sun 93 million miles away, and its light from its nuclear furnaces still reaching us, and its warmth upon our face. That God has nothing to do with our prissy, constricting, fretful, prudish little ways. That God embraces every part of us, and proved that our flesh is beloved and embraced, because in the filth of an animal stall, surrounded by dung and mire, unwanted and bitterly cold, the divine and the human met, merged, anointed one another, joined with one another, and God declared that we are all heirs of the divine. That God hates nothing that God has made, and we and every part of us, as I've said before, with all our flab and our squidgy bits and our unwholesome bits, are beloved of God. There is not just some vision of perfection to which we must aspire, which may bring us close to God. No, it is the God that wakes up every morning and has to go to the bathroom. It is the God that wakes up and looks in the mirror and goes, oh, God. It is the God that cries to God. It is the God of our humiliations and our embarrassments. It is that God that loves and adores and cherishes us, and which we are beholden to embrace just as that God has embraced us. In the vastness and glory of the presence of God, we live every day. And life is so much more glorious if we can appreciate that. And us gathering together in the here and now, and every day and every week in church, is a way of us strengthening that vision of God and proclaiming it to the world. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's the most glorious thing that a human being can do. It's our birthright. It is where we will spend our eternity. Yes. This God is something we better start getting used to, because we're going to be with this God for a very, very long time.